we begin to read through Michelle Weber and Anderson Week's book, Process Approaches to Consciousness in Psychology, Neuroscience, and Philosophy of Mind. Now, we've already read a couple of Anderson Week's essays earlier in the semester, but now we're going to continue through this text, which is really a landmark text in consciousness studies, bringing Whitehead's philosophy to bear on some of the problems that we have been facing so far in this course, problems that have been articulated by analytic philosophers, by phenomenologists, and by neuroscientists and psychologists. This book is interdisciplinary. It's in effect an expression of Whitehead's protest against the compartmentalization of knowledge. And indeed, I tried to design this course to draw on as many different disciplinary perspectives as possible as part of this protest. The universe does not come pre-packaged in the disciplinary silos by which we structure the modern research university, right? And it would be a good thing. Whitehead himself was an advocate for this sort of educational reform. It would be a good thing if the university system was structured more like the universe, right? That is, as a creative process of relationship, as a relational process, right? Where there is no entity in the universe that can be understood in abstraction from its relations to other entities, that all of the organizational scales in the universe, whether we're talking about the atomic, whether we're talking about the biological or the organic, whether we're talking about the psychological or the social, all of these different scales, these layers of organization must be part of the same cosmos. And Whitehead's metaphysical scheme is an effort to understand all of these layers in a coherent and adequate way. So, as Weeks and Weber point out in their introduction, Whitehead's thought for decades after his death in 1947, it was taken up by theologians, for the most part. Process theology really thrived among American Protestant thinkers, thinkers like Charles Hartshorne and David Ray Griffin and John Cobb Jr., who you may know is doing a course on process and reality right now online. I highly recommend that. I think I've linked you to it earlier in the semester. But Weber and Weeks point out that after decades of this activity among theologians, Whitehead's scholarship fell into a period of scholasticism, which is to say, debates among experts using the jargon of Whitehead. There wasn't much attempt to reach beyond the Whiteheadian community in order to influence the ongoing debates about consciousness, for example. Now, of course, there was some really great work done by, I think especially David Ray Griffin and John Cobb Jr., to enter into dialogue with scholars and scientists, philosophers, and other fields to say, hey, this is what Whitehead would say about this. What do you think? There are some great books that came out of that. But for the most part, there was a period of scholasticism, and then there was a resurgence of interest in Whitehead. And as Weber and Weeks put it, outsiders are now storming the museum. Just as I was in the midst of writing my own dissertation about 5 years ago, all these new books were coming out on Whitehead, applying his thought to everything from media theory to agroecology to quantum physics and relativity theory. So we're in a new era of Whitehead studies, right? The outsiders have stormed the museum, and they're not treating Whitehead's thought just as museum curators would. They're applying it. They're tinkering with it. They're putting it to work for their own purposes. So this is a really good thing, I would say. Now, I want to share an excerpt on page 8 from the introduction, from Weber and Weeks' introduction, where they make a very important point about Whitehead's Panexperientialism and how we can based on our own conscious experience, make claims about more general or generic experience that pervades the universe, right? So they write on page 8, if human consciousness passed through more primitive stages in its own evolution, if it passes through cumulative phases in the recovery from unconsciousness, if it passes through distinct phases in the early motor development of the individual and its subsequent socialization, if it passes through a nested hierarchy of phases as it emerges moment by moment from the neural activity of the brain, then it makes no sense to deny that we have any criteria for generalizing an attenuated concept of consciousness beyond human experience. So they're pointing out that Whitehead's Panexperientialism is based on this generalization from our own experience to the processes that are operating in the rest of the physical universe. And they want us to recognize that in our own experience, there is more than just the clear and distinct ideas of waking rational consciousness. In fact, most of the time, when we're driving the car or we are daydreaming or for at least a third of our lives we're asleep, most of the time we're not conscious in that rational, egoic sense. Most of the time, we are experiencing the world through our bodies, through our emotions, and various other forms that are not strictly speaking consciousness. So we do have a data set to draw on to make these generalizations, to understand how the rest of the universe may function in a way that is akin to at least an attenuated concept of our own consciousness. So then Weeks and Weber go on to summarize the rest of the chapters in this book. We're not going to read all the chapters ourselves, but perhaps you'll see a description of one chapter that you really do want to read and maybe talk about in your final paper. I encourage you to do that. So then in chapter 1, Weeks and Weber continue to discuss process thought as a heuristic for investigating consciousness. And there's an interesting part where they compare Husserl to Whitehead, as we've done before, looking at how phenomenology in some ways prefigures William James's radical empiricism, but how there are also important differences, right? I'll get more into that in a moment. There's another excerpt I want to read where Weber and Weeks are talking about how altered forms or fugitive forms of consciousness, as they put it, can teach us a lot about the origin and the conditions that make consciousness possible. So on page 52, they write, "The fact that we must begin with normal consciousness does not mean we have to remain there. Whitehead thinks that marginal experience offers an opportunity to circumscribe a very different concept of subjectivity than the one we are accustomed to, a weak subjectivity, which is only faintly like the strong subjectivity of consciousness. If he is right, it may turn out, after all, that consciousness is the philosopher's stone." Earlier, they described consciousness as the philosopher's stone because so much of the discourse is akin to, and this is kind of a caricature of alchemy, there's, I think, more depth. Anyone who's read Jung, for example, would know that there's more depth to alchemy than this, but the idea is that the hard problem of consciousness and all the flurry of work and the frenzy of effort to solve this hard problem is akin to the alchemists trying to figure out how to turn lead into gold, right? How does mere matter transform or transmute into consciousness? So consciousness is the philosopher's stone. So Weber and Weeks continue, "For if we can find within consciousness or at its fringes, in its liminal, implicit, or fugitive states, or in states deviant, weakened, or disturbed on normal accounting, if we can find within this the vestige of a world differently disclosed and no longer incompatible with the existence of consciousness, then we can use consciousness against itself to transmute the false show of objectivity into something possibly less transparent, but probably more real. If what we lose is the transparency of the world dear to normal consciousness, what we gain is the meaningfulness of that world. Whitehead thinks this process of transmutation, which after all is just a biological critique of normal consciousness, is indeed possible, and that it reveals to us a world urged on from countless centers of weak subjectivity, whose evolving interactions are the course of nature alive with possibilities. This is a nature in and from which the coming to be of the strong subjectivity of consciousness is no longer impossible. If the epiphany of such a world flickers in the meditations of philosophers or in the margins of everyday experience, it might be better described not as a transmutation, but as a reversal, however brief, partial, or unstable, of the transmutation already wrought upon the world by normal consciousness. The dramatic implication for psychology, however, is that clear and distinct consciousness requires elucidation from more primitive and usually marginal or transmarginal forms of awareness, not the other way around. So this is a sort of invitation to approach consciousness from the margins rather than from the center, right? And to try to understand its nature not with the ego at the center, not beginning with highly abstract egoic consciousness, but beginning with the fringes of consciousness, with the fractal edges, or the frothy edges, if you want, of our awareness, deepening into these liminal modes of experience, whether through whatever form of alteration of consciousness, such as psychedelics, as we explored in an earlier module, or through meditation, through yoga practice, breathing exercises, and so on. So now in chapter 5, the Whiteheadian philosopher and theologian David Ray Griffin describes Whitehead's concept of consciousness. And it's a concept of consciousness as, in Whitehead's jargon, an intellectual feeling, or the subjective form of an intellectual feeling. And to understand what that means, of course, Griffin has to unpack Whitehead's understanding of the various phases that go into the experience that compose or concress the experience of an actual occasion. Whitehead has an ontology that is made up of these events or these actual occasions of experience, right? And for Whitehead, consciousness, as we normally understand it, is actually quite peripheral. Now, experience, which is a form of non-conscious feeling, if you will, pervades the universe. But that non-conscious feeling or that experience only becomes conscious in the late phase of a very rare form of actual occasion, right? The actual occasions associated with complex animals and human beings can sometimes experience consciousness, but Whitehead wants to be able to describe a more generic form of experience that's not conscious. And so as a form of panpsychism, Whitehead's Panexperientialism is not saying that rocks are conscious or that chairs are conscious. Rather, Whitehead wants to make a distinction, an important distinction, between aggregates and individuals. And Griffin goes into this important distinction. It's not Whitehead's original idea. Leibniz also makes this distinction between aggregates and individuals. And for Whitehead, there are two types of individuals. There are simple individuals, and those are the actual occasions of experience. And then there are compound individuals, which are what Whitehead calls societies of actual occasions. Compound individuals are, for example, cells or animals. The human being, the human soul, is a compound individual. And a compound individual is a serially ordered, or it's a historical root of actual occasions of experience that are especially intimately related to one another. We'll get more into that in a moment. So Griffin also wants to remind us about Whitehead's pragmatic orientation, right? He's inheriting William James's pragmatism, which is what directs Whitehead to our concrete experience and to our common sense presuppositions. So for Whitehead, all of our metaphysical explanations must bow to common sense, right? We have to avoid what the German philosopher Habermas called performative contradictions. A performative contradiction is where someone negates what in practice they presuppose, right? So often neuroscientists will engage in a study of brain activity in an attempt to prove that free will is an illusion. The problem with this is that if free will is an illusion, then so is science, right? We cannot search for explanations scientifically if our own consciousness, which is in pursuit of said explanations, is in fact just an automaton, just an illusion generated by some mechanical process. So, Whitehead famously says in his book, The Function of Reason, scientists, animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless, constitute an interesting subject for study, right? Whitehead's humor, when it shows up, is very dry, but I think also hilarious. So we have to avoid performative contradictions. We have to approach our metaphysical explanations as though the common sense presuppositions of everyday life were irrefutable, undeniable, right? There are certain hardcore common sense presuppositions, as Griffin describes them, and he lists 4 of them. Maybe there are more, but he lists at least these 4, these overpowering notions of hardcore common sense. One is that conscious experience exists, right? And we can agree with Descartes that we cannot deny or doubt the existence of our unconsciousness, right? I think, therefore I am. It's irrefutable. Number 2, we cannot deny that consciousness influences the body. We have some capacity for directing our movement. Number 3, consciousness has some degree of freedom. And number 4, consciousness can act in accord with norms or with ideals, like the 3 big ones, like truth, beauty, and goodness. We can act in accord with these ideals. So we're not just free, right? We can act in accordance with norms. We can act in accordance with aesthetic norms like beauty, with moral norms like goodness, with cognitive or intellectual norms like truth, right? And I hope you'll notice that these 4 overpowering notions of hardcore common sense, they're all necessary for science to be possible, right? And so for science in its materialistic, reductionistic mode, to try to explain away consciousness as nothing but the activity of a mechanical brain, it's denying its own conditions of possibility, right? This is performative contradiction. Really important notion that Griffin, I hope, clarifies and makes evident. Griffin then goes on to explain and elucidate Whitehead's metaphysics of experience as a description of experience as a perpetual oscillation between subject and object. So rather than in the typical understanding of a subject's relationship to an object, where the subject is pre-given and it internally represents or pictures objects in the external world, for Whitehead, experience is a perpetual oscillation. What is a subject in one moment becomes an object in the next. It's a phasic process, right? So that there are different ways of breaking down the phases, but there are 2 basic phases or poles, the physical and the mental pole, where the physical pole is the inheritance of the feelings from the past. It's the inheritance of already perished experiences. and the mental pole is the anticipation of the future. And one of the ways that Whitehead preserves this notion of freedom, some degree of freedom that consciousness and all experience possesses, is by pointing to this perpetual oscillation. And where our freedom comes in, it's not like classical liberal notions of freedom that you'll find in Locke or Descartes or these other modern thinkers. Whitehead doesn't think that we are a pre-existing subject that has freedom. His view is subtler and I think more profound than that. Whitehead says that we realize our freedom to affect the future, only superjectively, which is to say, only in the perishing of our own subjective immediacy in the present, only in becoming objectively immortal do we exercise our freedom. So in a sense, freedom is exercised only in the dying or the death of each of our moments of subjective immediacy. We have to forego control and paradoxically, we have to forego ownership over our experience, thrust it into the future as a perished experience, as a superject, and thereby hope to affect the future, right? And this perpetual oscillation between the inheritance of the past, a decision in the present, and a superjective effort to affect the future. This is how the stream or the historical root of actual occasions that composes our psyche, this is how it is composed. It's composed of these repeating or oscillating processes of a subject becoming an object, to be inherited by the next subject, which becomes an object. And our freedom is the freedom to influence the next moment of experience, right? And to influence that next moment of experience, we have to die to our present experience. There's a poem by Goethe that captures this sentiment, Whitehead's understanding of freedom. I believe the poem's titled Blissful Yearning, and that's the translation. It's from the West Eastern Divan, a collection of Goethe's poems. And Goethe says, "Tell it to no one but the wise. The crowd will only jeer. The living thing I praise, that longs for death by fire. Cooling in those nights of love, conceiving as you were conceived, a strange emotion fills you, while the quiet candle gleams. You are no longer in the grasp of shadows darkening. A new desire lifts you up, on to a higher mating. No distance can weigh you down. Enchanted you come flying, and greedy for the light at last, a moth, you burn in dying. And as long as you lack this true word, die and become, you'll be but a dismal guest in earth's darkened room." So this true word that Goethe utters, 2 words actually, or 3, die and become, I think, and the sentiment of this whole poem, which I interpret to be about the creative act, I think is a poetic rendering of Whitehead's understanding of how freedom is realized in this perpetual oscillation between a physical and a mental pole, between a subject and a superject or an object. So Griffin also talks about consciousness as this intellectual feeling of the subjective form of an intellectual feeling. It's a very late phase of concrescence, and I'm not going to try to elaborate on the different phases of concrescence, but in general, as I've mentioned, there's a physical phase and a mental phase, and the intellectual feeling is part of the mental phase of consciousness, and it has to do with consciousness, has to do with an actual entity's ability to compare what's physically prehended or perceived with what might be, right? So it's comparison or a contrast between what is physically given and what is still ideally possible. And for Whitehead, these ideal possibilities are called eternal objects. And so consciousness is this experience of the contrast between what is given in our physical experience, in the physical pole of concrescence, a contrast between that and what is possible, what is held in possibility in the mental pole of experience. And so consciousness is about negation in a way. It's our ability to reflect on what's given and to imagine alternatives. And for Whitehead, this is actually a pretty rare form of experience, right? In this sense, consciousness for Whitehead is the crown and not the base of experience. In chapter 6, Michael Katsko looks at the way that Whitehead's metaphysical scheme and understanding of consciousness can help us integrate the literature and interpret it. The literature, in this case, being analytic philosophy and neuroscience. A lot of the thinkers that we have read earlier this semester will be brought into discussion by Katsko. And he points out the way that all of them, Chalmers and Dennett and the rest, they assume what Whitehead refers to as the bifurcation of nature, which leads them to presuppose very abstract concepts of matter and of mind, right? And so for Whitehead, the bifurcation of nature is basically akin to what Galileo did when he separated primary and secondary characteristics of things. And Whitehead thinks that this separation was actually rather arbitrary, because why is it that we put certain qualia, like our sensory experience of sounds, tastes, and colors, on the subjective side of the bifurcation and say that they're merely in the mind, and we put other qualia like touch, which is where we gain our understanding of inertia or physical motion, why we put that on the objective side of the bifurcation? Because Whitehead's pointing out there is no primary characteristic, as Galileo understood it, that isn't also derived from our own bodily experience. It might not be from one of the main senses like the eyes or the ears, but our sense of bodily causal efficacy is where we derive our understanding of inertia, right? This seemingly objective physical quality. So Whitehead thinks this bifurcation is arbitrary, and for Whitehead, as he first stepped out of mathematics and physics and into philosophy in his book, The Concept of Nature, published in 1920, he says, nature is everything we are aware of in perception. We cannot pick and choose in this arbitrary way that leads to the bifurcation. But Whitehead also wants us to, as philosophers, as scientists, to take account of our own intellectual activity. We cannot abstract ourselves from the data we are trying to explain. So while in the concept of nature, Whitehead says nature is just what we are aware of in perception, and he's kind of bracketing the mind. It's kind of a way of putting to the side the difficulties, the metaphysical difficulties of understanding the relationship of mind to nature at this earlier stage of his philosophical development. Whitehead's just saying, we'll deal with mind later. It's a metaphysical issue. If we just want to know what nature is, though, so that we can do science effectively, we should define nature as what we are aware of in perception. But if we're going to do metaphysics, if we're going to understand the relationship between mind and nature, between the intellectual activity and what we are aware of in perception, then we're going to need to not abstract ourselves from the data we're trying to explain. And Katsko is pointing out, with all of these different analytic philosophers, the way that their own process of intellectual reflection is just sort of taken for granted or left out. They don't explain their own capacity for explanation. And they explain the natural world in such a way that it makes it impossible for that natural world to provide the condition for their own intellectual activity, for their own explanatory capacity. So I think Catsko has a very effective way of critiquing these theorists, but also saving some of their key insights and putting them into a new order, giving them a new interpretation within the context of Whitehead's scheme. In chapter 6, Michael Catsko looks at the way that Whitehead's metaphysical scheme and understanding of consciousness can help us integrate the literature and interpret it. The literature, in this case, being analytic philosophy and neuroscience. A lot of the thinkers that we have read earlier this semester will be brought into discussion by Catsko. And he points out the way that all of them, Chalmers and Dennett and the rest, they assume what Whitehead refers to as the bifurcation of nature, which leads them to presuppose very abstract concepts of matter and of mind, right? And so for Whitehead, the bifurcation of nature is basically akin to what Galileo did when he separated primary and secondary characteristics of things. And Whitehead thinks that this separation was actually rather arbitrary, because why is it that we put certain qualia, like our sensory experience of sounds, tastes, and colors, on the subjective side of the bifurcation and say that they're merely in the mind, and we put other qualia like touch, which is where we gain our understanding of inertia or physical motion, why we put that on the objective side of the bifurcation? Because Whitehead's pointing out there is no primary characteristic, as Galileo understood it, that isn't also derived from our own bodily experience. It might not be from one of the main senses like the eyes or the ears, but our sense of bodily causal efficacy is where we derive our understanding of inertia, right? This seemingly objective physical quality. So Whitehead thinks this bifurcation is arbitrary, and for Whitehead, as he first stepped out of mathematics and physics and into philosophy in his book, The Concept of Nature, published in 1920, he says, nature is everything we are aware of in perception. We cannot pick and choose in this arbitrary way that leads to the bifurcation. But Whitehead also wants us to, as philosophers, as scientists, to take account of our own intellectual activity. We cannot abstract ourselves from the data we are trying to explain. So while in the concept of nature, Whitehead says nature is just what we are aware of in perception, and he's kind of bracketing the mind. It's kind of a way of putting to the side the difficulties, the metaphysical difficulties of understanding the relationship of mind to nature at this earlier stage of his philosophical development. Whitehead's just saying, we'll deal with mind later. It's a metaphysical issue. If we just want to know what nature is, though, so that we can do science effectively, we should define nature as what we are aware of in perception. But if we're going to do metaphysics, if we're going to understand the relationship between mind and nature, between the intellectual activity and what we are aware of in perception, then we're going to need to not abstract ourselves from the data we're trying to explain. And Catsko is pointing out, with all of these different analytic philosophers, the way that their own process of intellectual reflection is just sort of taken for granted or left out. They don't explain their own capacity for explanation. And they explain the natural world in such a way that it makes it impossible for that natural world to provide the condition for their own intellectual activity, for their own explanatory capacity. So I think Catsko has a very effective way of critiquing these theorists, but also saving some of their key insights and putting them into a new order, giving them a new interpretation within the context of Whitehead's scheme. Catsko then brings up this phenomenological notion of intentionality again, which Griffin had also mentioned, where Griffin had said that in Whitehead's scheme, intentionality is not just limited to consciousness, that these that more generic forms of experience, non-conscious experience, is structured with a sort of incipient intentionality. In prior lectures, I've tried to articulate a difference between what I've called prehensionality and intentionality, where intentionality is the aboutness of our conscious experience. It's the way that conscious experience is about objects or directed at objects, where it sort of presupposes an epistemological gap between the subject and the objects that it is having thoughts about, right? Whitehead's notion of prehension does not presuppose this gap. There is no gap. Rather, in the process of prehension, an actual occasion absorbs other actual occasions into itself. It doesn't merely represent them in some internal language of thought or symbolic code. It actually takes up perished occasions into itself. So it's a much more relational, a profoundly relational understanding that is absent in intentionality, which for Husserl was not about causality at all. So prehensionality is, I think, unique to Whitehead, and we can't simply understand it, as Griffin tries to, as a form of incipient or proto-intentionality. So I kind of disagree with Griffin there. But Catsko brings up this notion again, and he describes how for the phenomenologists like Husserl, intentionality is a way of accounting for this pervasive presence of otherness in our own experience, right? So the phenomenologists are aware of the way that subjectivity isn't simply closed in on itself. It's open to or directed toward objects. It's also intersubjective, right? It's directed toward other subjects. Where Whitehead differs, though, is in thinking of this otherness as, again, profoundly relational. And in terms of vectors, the transmission of feelings from the past into the present and from the present into the future. There's a vector character to experience, which for Whitehead is also a vector character of energy. And by reframing this understanding of how otherness is taken up by a subject into its own experience in terms of prehension, Whitehead avoids sort of entrenching this epistemological gap between mind and nature, between subject and object, because unlike intentionality, which is the representation of an object by a subject in some language of thought, prehensionality is a transference of energy from one occasion to another. It's actually one occasion of experience, one actual entity entering into and being absorbed by another, right? So Whitehead still does leave room at the late derivative phase of concrescence, called consciousness or intellectual feelings, for a type of intentional structure. But this intentional structure of consciousness is derivative from these more basic, more primal, prehensional forms of relationship.